Geography is also a form of destiny. And atoll is a fragile and precious formation, vulnerable to disruption, world-weary as we are. The beauty, the integrity, the purity of a host island opens up new vistas of hope and belief, even as the Maldives face the multiple challenges of climate change.
People need books as much as they need wellness, or they need jobs, or they need food. They need intellectual stimulation. They need stories. They need the ideas that sustain us all.
Today, as we go from continent to continent, much of the work that we do is really how can we push back against the narrative of hatred that seems to have taken over the world? Can we bring together people who will, in a considered way, representing all perspectives, irrespective of our own personal ideologies and philosophies, allow each of us to empathize and understand about the other?
At Signify, our unique vision, it's inspired by nature, nature's magnitude, its mastery, its mystery. That's what really inspires us. Founded on shared passions, we're a team of people who work hand in hand with nature to create beautiful, beyond bespoke experiences where discovery is a daily way of life.
It's incredible to be here in Sunabafushi, just really the most extraordinary place. And to be here with JLF, which I had joined in the past, but only virtually. And so for me, this is, in some ways it feels like a homecoming because I'm meeting people who I've had conversations with before, but only through the computer. To be here with other people and in such an extraordinary place feels like a real privilege.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's just amazing. I come here, I give talks, I listen to the most fabulous conversations. I just heard one now. And it can go on not just for a few days, it can go on for months and keep going. And the source of information is just fabulous.
It feels like a transformational experience already to be somewhere so beautiful, so immersed in nature. I think the last 3 years, or 2 years that we've been on this pandemic where people have been living on their devices, really to feel like you're in a place where nature is the all-powerful, forcing you to let go a little bit of the outside world. And to, more than that, just be in community with people who I find fascinating and interesting and learning. Every panel I have listened to or attended, I mean, that's the case for any JLF festival, but particularly today, I feel like I learned so much. So I'm just thrilled and honored to be here.
Totally, I've really enjoyed that. I've been to some amazing talks already since I've been here, and it's so comfortable. You can just really sit back and relax and just focus on listening to it, on the ideas, on the exchange of ideas. I think it's really important, and you kind of forget in the everyday rush of life from one thing to another, and it's hard to stop and really make time for those things. But here there's the opportunity to do that, and yeah, it's wonderful.
Travel session. Travel writing is among the most ancient forms of literature. It allows invaluable social, culture, and political insight. It can signify personal journeys and growth, the intricate histories of places and peoples, and even the powers and limits of the mind. Pallavi Aiyar, Colin Thubron, Monisha Rajesh, Anthony Sattin, and Tharik Hussain discuss their work, inspirations, and choice genre with writer, historian, and festival co-director William Dalrymple. This session will have a Q&A at the end, and it's warmly welcome all of you on stage. Willie, I'll give you time.
Thank you so much.
So I'll give you 5 minutes before Q&A starts.
Perfect. Brilliant. Do you want to be? I'm going to sit here in the corner and stare at you on the sidelines.
Water. I know it's in the middle, but may I give it to all of you if you want? Yes. I'll just pour it. Thank you. Please start.
So, welcome to the travel session. This is one of our regular Jaipur slots, and many around this arc. I think everyone except Tharik has done at least one of these in the past. We have a standard format whereby everybody reads a short passage. It doesn't work, readings, I find, at literary festivals, often with novels, but it works extremely well with travel writing, which often can be short gobbets, can work very nicely. Afterwards, we're going to branch into discussion about some of the aspects of travel writing. We have a distinguished and very varied panel, and as you'll see from their writing, with experiences of many different parts of the world. Pallavi has written extensively, now based in Spain, as old Jaipur friend and hero of the festival. Colin has been a couple of times, wonderful readings on the Silk Road and Kailash, and regarded by many as the greatest living travel writer, and very much the king of our small world here. Tharik is the new star on the block. I believe I'm right in saying only the third or fourth South Asian author who's made a starring role on the Bailey Gifford / Samuel Johnson shortlists and longlists. It's a very interesting contrast because Indian literature is full of winners of fiction prizes. And there's barely a year goes by when Indian or South Asian writing is not either winning or shortlisted, and certainly longlisted for the Booker. But it has been much less successful in scaling the heights of non-fiction. I'm not sure why that is. It's very interesting that it is so. But Tharik is a man who's changing that. Samat Subramaniam has also been a very successful Indian travel writer, also gone on the shortlist. Manisha has won a clutch of awards over the last few years for her amazing books, particularly on train travel. Although she, your articles are on all sorts of other things, but your books have so far stuck to this extremely this art that she has managed to corner and perfect. And we're still waiting for her to replace Michael Portillo on the gin and tonic line, or whatever they call that annual programme on Railways of the Raj. And we should all write to the BBC controller of programmes and demand that Michael Portillo's red trousers are retired, and Manisha comes to represent him. Anthony Sattin has written both on travel and on history, but often with Africa and the Arab world at the centre of his work. Almost as much a veteran as Colin, though his Adrian Brody-like good looks hide the venerable passage of his years. I read a few travel books early in my career. We'll be reading from one of them. Anyway, if we started, we just go in this direction. Pallavi, do you want to kick off?
Right. So I'm going to be reading from my latest book, which is called Orienting an Indian in Japan. And I was trying to figure out which bit to read for you today. And then I thought I'd read a bit about elephants, because they're lovely creatures. And there's a sort of interesting vignette in which elephants feature between India and Japan. One further character of heft, quite literally in this case, that it would be remiss to omit when talking of post-war India-Japan bonhomie, was an elephant. In 1949, Jawaharlal Nehru, independent India's first prime minister, engaged in a deft bit of pachydermic diplomacy by dispatching an elephant named after his own daughter, Indira, to Tokyo's Ueno Zoo as a gift to the children of Japan. The elephant went on to become the zoo's star attraction and an enduring symbol of Indian friendliness towards Japan. But this entire episode was occasioned by an incident that was achingly tragic and also involved former ambassadors of India, the elephants Tonki and John. A male and female pair, they had been acquired by the zoo from India in 1924 and were joined by a third elephant, Hanako, from Thailand about a decade later. During the Second World War, it was resolved to kill the zoo's most dangerous animals to deal with the possibility of them escaping during an air attack. Consequently, in 1943, the 3 elephants were starved to death. There are accounts of how Tonki, who lasted the longest of the 3, desperately performed tricks every time a human passed his enclosure in the vain hope of some food. In Japan, the gruesomeness of this slaughter is often glossed over, although there are some anodyne accounts made palatable for children. For example, the enormously popular picture book Kawai Sona Zo was originally published in 1951 and remains in print. In general, the sad fate of Ueno's wartime elephants was largely eclipsed by the arrival of Indira, whose journey to Japan from the jungles of Mysore began in a petition submitted to the upper house of the Japanese parliament by 2 precocious 7th graders. The students were sad that they no longer were able to see an elephant at the zoo and asked whether a new one could be procured. Their petition snowballed into a public campaign, and in the end, the Tokyo government collected over 1,000 letters from children, all addressed to the Prime Minister of India, pleading with him to send them a replacement elephant. Nehru acquiesced, and Indira's arrival at Ueno on the 25th of September 1949 caused much excitement in Tokyo. The zoo was packed to capacity with thousands of people trying to glimpse the new elephant. Tadamichi Koga, who was the head of the zoo at the time, later said that receiving Indira was one of the happiest moments in his life. Since she could only follow commands in Kannada, her mother tongue, Indira's Japanese handlers, Sugaya and Shibuya, had to learn how to communicate with her from the 2 Indian mahouts who had accompanied the elephant from Mysore. By the 1970s, the elephant's stardom had somewhat dimmed, particularly after a couple of giant pandas from China arrived at the zoo in 1972. Nonetheless, she did remain an object of affection, and when she died in 1983, Tokyo's Governor Suzuki paid tribute to her. She gave a big dream to Japanese children and played a good role in Japan-India friendship, he said. Over the centuries, the Japan-India story had featured a motley cast of characters: traveling monks, fugitives, cooks, poets, movie stars, and elephants. Attempting to tie them all neatly together for the purpose of a conclusion feels somewhat disingenuous, and it might be best to end this section with the letter that Jawaharlal Nehru addressed to the children of Japan when he sent them an elephant. Indira is a fine elephant, very well behaved, he wrote. I hope that when the children of India and the children of Japan will grow up, they will serve not only their great countries, but also the cause of peace and cooperation all over Asia and the world. So you must look upon this elephant, Indira by name, as a messenger of affection and goodwill from the children of India. The elephant is a noble animal. It is wise and patient, strong and yet gentle, and I hope all of us will also develop these qualities.
I hope this is working. Can we? It is. Right. I've chosen the end of a book that I wrote on Siberia. This is rather lowering the euphoric tone of the elephant, I'm afraid. in an area called Kolyma, which is really the worst area of Stalin's gulags which were abandoned over 50 years before I wrote this, and abandoned in the Russian way, not demolished in shame or turned into penitential museums as they would have been in Eastern Europe, but just allowed to moulder away. And here I am at the very end of the book. An hour before dawn, I go back into the hills for the last time. A young geologist, Yuri, says he knows the track to Bukhari-Chag. This is almost the oldest and worst of the gulags, and that his twin-axle van can reach there. But it's no place to linger. The native Evenk people call it the place where reindeer sicken, and their herdsmen sensed something was wrong there. Its earth is filled with radioactive uranium. The moment we enter the mountains, the snow hits us in a blinding curtain. It swirls like ground mist over the road, concealing crevices and black ice together. Our engine coughs and roars. Towards dawn, we grind to a halt on a pass, while the blizzard tears the surface from the mountain above us in a howling dust. We wait as a wan morning breaks, and Arctic hares shelter against our wheels. The iron frame of the camp gates stands redundant in the debris of its towers. Beneath the snow, our feet snag on objects we only guess at. We stumble through the wrecks of barracks and prison cells. In the roofless rooms, the guards' benches are still in place, with a rank of hooks for their coats. The snow lies on their platform beds in hard crystalline piles. A pair of boots is discarded by a stove. The air seems thin, but Yuri's cheeks are pink and burnished. He's kicking the snow from around a grid of notched stumps to uncover wood foundations. That's where the tents were, he says. That's where they slept. It was the same through much of Kolyma. The prisoners lived and died in tents. Despairingly, they pressed insulating moss and peat between the twin layers of canvas, sprinkled them with sawdust, and stacked boards outside. Inside was a single cast-iron stove. And now, gently, insistently, the snow is falling. It drifts over the low stumps and covers the buildings with its pale indifference. It floats through the roofless passages, the guard chambers, the rooms of administration, of neglect, of boredom. It fills the valley with a sick translucence. Yuri goes on kicking at the tent foundations, then looks up at me. You know, my grandfather was a village postman who spent years in the camps for making a joke about Stalin. A joke? Yes, he was in charge of the village telephone, and one day he told somebody in passing, by the way, Stalin's on the phone to you. So he ended up in the gulag for 5 years. My parents must have suffered for that. He presses a wooden slat back with his boot. People grew up in their parents' silence. We climb to where he remembers the cemetery lay, but it's lost under snow. The opalescent light has intensified over the valley. Around us, the trees and shrubs are laden and heavy, as if bearing white fruit. They shiver with tiny wagtails. I pick some dwarf cedar needles, which prisoners used to boil in the futile hope of deflecting scurvy. I say, whatever it's like now, things are better than they were. Yuri does not answer at first. Everything with him takes a long time. He says, those were religious times, in a way. People believe things. He seems to envy that. So suffering came down from the sky, as natural as rain or hail. There was no one to accuse. No one was near enough, embodied enough. Stalin's empire, like Hitler's Reich, was meant to last through all imaginable time. The past had been reorganized forever, the future preordained. I say, not knowing, you'll never go back to that. Yuri says, we're not the same as you in the West. Maybe we're more like you were centuries ago. We're late with our history here. With us, time still goes in circles. I don't want to hear this, not here in the heart of darkness. I want him to call this place an atrocious mystery. I want him not to understand it. With his blonde moustache and tartar cheekbones, I've cast him as the quintessential Russian, the litmus test for the future. The mountain air has gone to my head. but his hand, which was tracing a circle, now tentatively lifts. Maybe we spiral a little, he says, a little upwards. He looks across to where the cableways limp in ghastly procession over the heights. I wish my grandfather had lived on. He loved a good joke, and people can at least joke about anything now. We've still got jokes. I clasp his shoulder, but we are too fat in our quilted coats, and my hand slips from him. He smiles for the first time on a mouthful of discoloured teeth before turning back along the track. And on that frozen hillside, he starts to sing.
Thank you. So I'm going to read from my book, Minarets in the Mountains, A Journey into Muslim Europe. And just to put the passage into context, we've arrived in Serbia, and prior to arriving in Serbia, I had absolutely no idea there was any such thing as a Muslim Serb. So, having been wowed by what can only be described as a Muslim choir sort of spontaneously appearing in the middle of the town centre, this is where we are at this point. When the unexpected concert ended, our bellies full of sausage and mushroom pizza, we headed over to the open square in front of the Hotel Vrbac. Decorative stone bridges crisscrossed the River Ljutska as it backed onto the paved square where locals came to relax for the evening. Old men chewed the fat on benches beside pretty flower beds, and shrieking toddlers zoomed around on rented motorised 4x4 toy cars, their parents nattering away with one eye on the pint-sized racing drivers. Some wandered off to grab a snack from the street vendors lining the edges. "Dad, can we please get some candy floss?" Anaya pleaded, pointing to a man pulling out pink swirls from a spinning metal drum. "Yes, please, can we have some?" chimed in a manny. The vendor didn't speak English, and so I signalled we wanted two, using my fingers. He pointed to some coloured tubs, which were the flavours. Both the girls chose red, and we watched as he did his thing. Tamara asked if we could film by pointing at her camera phone, and he nodded. The heavy-set man, whose work was clearly exhausting, judging by the sweat beads gathered on his forehead, began spinning his drum. He then took out a thin wooden stick and poured red sugary powder into a tube in the centre, beneath which a flame flickered infrequently. Waiting a few seconds, he held the stick close to the edge of the central tube. We watched, mesmerised. At first we couldn't see anything, and then slowly, very faint, thin, web-like strands of red began to attach themselves to the stick. We collectively cooed. As soon as the sweaty vendor finished making our second red candy floss and handed it to Amani, I tried to thrust a 1,000 dinar note into his hand, about £8 British. But the vendor moved his hand away and shook his head, before starting his drum up again for the next customers, a small boy and his mother. I was confused. Was the note too large or too small? Surely he wasn't expecting to charge more than £4 each for candy floss. Begrudgingly, I added another 1,000 dinar note, hoping he had made some mistake and wasn't just trying to rip me off. But again, he refused to take my money. And this time, he didn't even look at the notes. Could he even see what I was offering? My confusion increased. Surely this was more than enough for 2 candy floss. Our dinner for 4 had cost less. I decided to try one last time, stretching out the crisp notes to make it clear what I was giving him. But again, he refused, without looking at the money, or even me for that matter. He simply shook his head and turned away. It began to dawn on me. He wasn't asking for more money at all. He was flat refusing to take any payment, and I suddenly remembered why. Now overcome with guilt, I tried putting the money directly into his breast pocket, but he saw it coming and moved away, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Tourist," he said, shaking his head again. "Tamara," I said, turning to my family who had been watching the children play and missed the entire exchange, "he won't take my money." "Why, Dad, what's wrong?" and I asked, looking a tad alarmed. "He won't take your money?" Amani repeated. "Don't you have enough?" "No, it's not that. I have more than enough. He just won't take my money." "Tourist," said the vendor, again, this time addressing my whole family with a smile. Tamara and I looked at each other. We both knew what he was doing. It melted our hearts. Tamara was almost tearful. I had forgotten what she had read me the night before, which is why I was so confused to begin with. As we had sat in our little cottage in the Serbian countryside, getting excited about visiting a Muslim town in Serbia, Tamara had read aloud a section in our guidebook about a strange tradition amongst the vendors of Novi Pazar, where they refused payment for small items from travellers, instead offering it as a gift. It was their way of honouring the traveller, an ancient tradition in this historic market town, where travellers from the great cities of antiquity used to pass through regularly, now a forgotten backwater in southern Serbia. It was also a way for the vendors of Novi Pazar to show their appreciation to anyone willing to visit their town. When we had read it, we had not taken too much notice, assuming it was unlikely to happen to us. I asked the man his name and thanked him in English and Arabic. Mehrat, he replied with a smile, bowing his head slightly and putting his hand on his heart. We were genuinely moved, and as we walked away, I mentally reprimanded myself for being suspicious. We then turned to our two girls who remained confused, to explain the beautiful tradition of hospitality, and I ripped a tuft of pink candy floss from her stick and handed it to me. I could see her mulling over what we had just said as she chewed away. So he just gave this to us free because we are tourists? She finally asked. Yep. She paused. Can we get more free stuff then? That's not the point, Anaya, Amani snapped, stepping into her role as conscientious older sister. I took Anaya by the hand and turned her to face the vendor, just as he wiped the sweat from his brow from the umpteenth time. From where we sat, we could see the amateur construction of his homemade candy floss machine. Wires ran from the half drum, which had been sawn from a whole one, and connected to a car battery near his foot. The drum wobbled ever so slightly every time it did a full orbit on its axis, with the vendor having to regularly readjust it to stop it toppling over completely. Look at him, Po. I used the shortened version of her nickname, Posy, whenever I spoke to her, as if she were my little baby girl again. She was 12 now, and in her mind, a fully grown big girl. Look at his machine. He made that himself. Can you see how it runs off a car battery? Does he look like he can afford to give anything away for free? Naya shook her head. So why does he, she asked. Because he knows what he loses in money tonight doesn't come close to what he stands to gain with his little act of kindness. We had brought our girls up to understand that charity was an important duty for us as people and as Muslims. It was one of the 5 pillars of our faith. They had joined us in volunteering at soup kitchens, handed out parcels from Ramadan food stalls, and made it a tradition to take food, hygiene items and warm bedding every winter to London's homeless. So Anaya fully understood charity, but this wasn't quite charity. It came from a similar place, but it wasn't the same, and that's why it was probably a bit more difficult for her to grasp. In a way, it was for all of us. We had never experienced anything like it on the road before. We had experienced the kindness of strangers for sure, but not working vendors refusing our money because we were travellers. Our experiences had always been quite the opposite. The vendors always wanted our money because we were travellers. The tradition of looking after travellers has always historically been a strong one in Muslim lands, and is still observed by many Muslims today. For 3 days, any traveller that comes to stay with you should be treated entirely as your guest. To the best of your ability, you should house and feed them so they do not have to spend their own money. It is one of my favourite Muslim traditions, and I've enjoyed the benefits of it many times when visiting friends and family. I have also tried to observe the tradition when my own friends have come to visit, even with my non-Muslim ones. One of the first buildings Isa Beg built in Novi Pazar was a han, a caravanserai. These huge traveller inns were built at the Sultan's expense along key trading routes roughly every 30 to 40 kilometres, the distance a traveller covered on foot in a day. Any traveller, pilgrim or trader who turned up would receive free lodging and food for themselves and their beasts for 3 days at the expense of the Sultan. Whilst a stick or two of candy floss was not quite the same, it was a glimpse of the spirit of that beautiful ancient tradition, and it warmed me to see it here in a tiny, forgotten town in Serbia.
Thanks, Tharik. Is this on? Yes. Okay. I've chosen to read from my first book, Around India in 80 Trains. And to put this passage into context, I was travelling with my photographer, who's known as Passepartout in the book, and I was about halfway through my 5-month journey when my friend Ed from, where's Ed from? North of Grimsby. Ed decided to come out and join us for a week or two, and we were about to get on a train from Delhi to Mumbai, and this is a train where for the first time ever we haven't got single tickets and have somehow got double booked into a berth. So we've got 2 berths for 3 people, and we're currently trying to figure out our way around this for a 26-hour journey. Passepartout had struck up a deal with the bed linen man. Virendra had gone, and with the coast clear, an older attendant had agreed to let Passepartout sleep in his cupboard, setting the ambitious starting price of 500 rupees. He was an unshaven man with hanging jowls covered in white stubble and a shrewd opportunist. Edwin shook his head, laughing. 500 rupees? Is he mad? That bed guy's pulling a fast one. I know, but he's letting Ed share with me, and now he has nowhere to sleep, I replied. But 500 rupees is crazy. He shouldn't indulge that dirty fellow. But he has to sit up all night. At least we get to share one. You don't have to share. You can take mine. I always work at night, and I've got plenty of stuff to get through. I really don't mind sitting up. That's really kind, but not fair. It's okay, really, I don't mind. I've got my lappy. I can work. Ed was now eyeing me with a look that said, shut it, woman. This way we can both sleep comfortably. Through the windows, the terrain had transformed in the last hour, flattening into a red stretch that shimmered in the heat. White pyramids shot past in succession, salt mounds drying out in the sunshine. By tea time, the train galloped past cliff faces and over canyons, where the outlines of once thick rivers wormed their way along, now just streams waiting for a monsoon to restore their health. Since the Kerala Express, few other journeys had included such varied topography, so the Pune to Nizamuddin Duronto Express ranked highly in our esteem. Sorry, we're going from Pune, not Delhi to Mumbai. Even the interiors were upgraded. Nifty bottle holders replaced net pockets, and LED panels had ousted the rusty metal light fittings that often scraped the back of my head. Ed was beginning to look restless just as dinner arrived, which proved a timely distraction, and he happily made his way through chicken curry and dal, but made a great big show of edging away the ice cream. For his own good, I had forbidden Ed from eating any ice cream for fear that he might fall ill. Not ill with a sore throat and cold, which a lot of Indians seem to think were acquired not through viruses, but by drinking cold water and eating ice cream, but ill with a bad stomach. During power cuts, ice creams often melted and were then refrozen and melted again on numerous occasions, making them potentially lethal to weak stomachs. On my way back from the toilet, I caught him quietly licking the lid and he flicked it away. My tongue needed cooling after that curry, he muttered. Bit by bit, ladies in the compartment began to button up their cardigans and, much to Ed's delight, pull on woolly hats and knee socks. Bedtime was approaching and they were preparing themselves for the chilly night. Outside in the foyer, Passepartout was in the middle of his own bedtime shenanigans. The linen cupboards had been emptied of bedding, now distributed to passengers. A few sheets remained, lining the base of the cupboard that resembled the kind of box that magicians' assistants were sawn in. His bag was already in one end, and he now placed one foot on the edge of the door and tried to haul himself in without banging his head. He slotted one leg in, then carefully pulled in the other and lay down. He looked like he was in a coffin. I drew the door up to his neck just as an elderly man came to clean his teeth. He bent over the sink and cleared the back of his throat and nasal passages before hacking out the contents and gargling. As he looked up in the mirror, he caught sight of Passepartout's head poking out of the cupboard, where he was now propped up holding a torch and reading a copy of A Fine Balance in Norwegian. The man's eyes flew out on stalks, and he began to choke and laugh at the same time. I smiled politely, and the man walked wordlessly towards the door, looking back over his shoulder until he was gone. The door flew open a second later, and 3 children came tumbling through, looking for the crazy white man in the cupboard. Once the show was over, Passepartout fished a warm kingfisher out of his bag and waved me off to bed. Ed and Edwin were deep in conversation when I came back, trying to work out how 3 people could take it in turns to sleep in 2 beds over a period of 8 hours. Given that among the 3 of us, we had 3 undergraduate and 3 postgraduate degrees, none of us could work out the answer. By the morning, I'd slept for less than an hour. Climbing down from the berth, I found Ed, his body contorted into an unnatural coil, his head resting on a copy of Intimate Adventures of an Office Girl. Edwin was sliding off the end of the seat, his chin on his chest and one elbow across his face. Passepartout was hunched by the door and looked like he died during the night and then been frozen. The doors were wide open and the train was rolling quietly past the backs of Delhi slums, on approach to the station. It was nearing 7 a.m., and it was too early to even consider complaining. As we hopped down the steps, Ed shivered. Bloody hell, Delhi's not warm, is it? At least he was still talking to me after his first proper Indian train journey, so I considered the feat a great success.
I'm going to read you the opening of my new book, just published a couple of weeks ago, called Nomads, and it is a history, but there is a place even in history books for travel writing. And so while I was researching this book, which did take a long, long time, many people asked me, well, what is a nomad, and are there still nomads? And so I thought I would open the book with a description of meeting some nomads, and I met these people up in the Zagros Mountains in western Iran. So it's a description of their arrival. A young man walks towards me with a stick slung across his shoulder and a flock at his feet. The sheep in front, beside and behind him are as chaotic as meltwater in the nearby stream, and they carry him down the path like a crowd of rowdy children. An older man follows, weather-worn but still strong, a rifle over his left shoulder. He clicks his tongue to encourage them forward. Behind him are two women on donkeys, one older than the other, and I guess they are his wife and daughter. They look strong women, but then this is a tough life beneath the charred peaks of the Zagros Mountains. Other donkeys carry their belongings, bundled inside heavy rust and brown cloth that the women have woven and will soon repurpose as door flaps when the tents are set up. There are a few trees at this altitude, but the snow has melted, and there's an intense beauty and excellent grazing in the valley, blanketed with irises, dwarf tulips, and other spring flowers. The family is smiling as they lead their sheep and grey and white goats along the rock-strewn track towards me, the bucks sporting majestic swept-back horns. And I'm smiling with them, swept up by the excitement of the Bakhtiari tribe's annual migration from the plains into the mountains in search of summer pasture. I had already spent several days in the care of some other migrants. Siavash and his family had pitched their black goat-hair tents on the slope of the valley, building an enclosure for their sheep and preparing a large, open-sided tent to welcome neighbours and guests. My tent was across a stream flush with meltwater, and from it I had a big view of the jagged, snow-covered peaks and wildflower valley. A length of fat, flattened oil pipe served as a bridge between myself and the nomads, and also as a reminder that the Middle East's first oil strike, well number 1, had been made in nearby Bakhtiari territory in 1908. Everywhere there was beauty. If I were a photographer, I would have captured the shifting shadows and slanting sunbeams of afternoon as they tinted the snow mountains pink and cast gold across the surface of the stream. If I were a composer, I would have harmonized the rumble of the water with the clink of stones shifting across the riverbed, the buzzing of bees, the clanking of bells, and the whistling and whooping of men, bringing the flocks in for the night. There was beauty in all. But I'm a writer, and barefoot and slightly sunstruck, I pulled out a pencil to note the pure quality of light in the blue sky, the way that colours, especially yellows, popped in the green valley, and the sudden chill that descended as soon as the sun dropped behind the crest. Late that night, the nomads' tents glowed like embers across the river. The moon shone full above the mountain ridge, and I fell asleep wondering how Byron had known that not vainly did the early Persian make his high altar the high places and the peak, there to seek the spirit. My spirits were soaring in that high place, and I felt a deep welling of joy. Over the next couple of days, Siavash and his family introduced me to their valley and their people. They also fed me, and as we ate, they talked about their lives, the land they knew, their journeys across it, the animals they raised, the children they worried about, should they send them to state boarding school for their education, and the many other challenges of being a herder in the Zagros Mountains in the 21st century. They told me about plants in the valley, the animals that passed wild above our heads, and others that lived in the higher slopes. They knew all that could grow there, what to encourage, what to fear. They talked about the journey they made from the hot lowlands into the mountains, and how they would walk back again when the earth began to freeze beneath their feet, a journey their ancestors had made long before anyone began keeping records. I've heard similar stories from Bedouin and Berbers in North Africa and the Middle East, where I spent much of my adult life, from Tuareg and Wadabi beyond the mud houses and libraries of Timbuktu, from swift young Maasai, flashes of orange across the red East African bush, from nomads on the edge of the Thar Desert in India, on boats in the Andaman Sea, in the uplands of Kyrgyzstan and elsewhere in Asia. Whether with Berber or Bedouin, Gaucho or Moken, conversation always seemed to settle on the same issues, on continuity, on pride in belonging, on being in harmony with their surroundings, respecting all that nature offers, and on the difficulties of living a nomadic life when governments wanted them to settle. These people all reminded me of a subtle harmony that exists with the natural world. They knew their environment in a way that can only be acquired through living on equal footing with everything in that world, not in domination. Through a recognition that we humans are dependent on our surroundings, something those of us who live in towns and cities too easily forget. The Bakhtiari know the significance of each tone of their herds bleating, when they're content or hungry or threatened, whether a birth or death is near, just as they know how to read the clouds and the scents carried on the winds. The more I watched and listened, the more I was reminded that we'd all lived this way once, and not so very long ago in the greater scheme of human things.
Hard act to follow. Hard acts to follow, plural. This is a passage from a book I wrote about 10 years ago on the little religions of India, in a sense. The Bauls, the Theym dancers, the singers of epics in Rajasthan who sing the songs of Papuji. It's called 9 Lives. And I'm going to read you a little passage about a Baul called Debdas, partly because Teamwork are currently recording Debu and Kanai with Sushila Raman, and there's going to be a new musical project that Teamwork are doing. But this is not about their music, this is about how Debu, who had been born a Brahmin but had run away from home and thrown his sacred thread into the Ganges at Varanasi and left what he thought, in a sense, Orthodox Hinduism to become a Baul, a wandering minstrel. And this is his account of him beginning this difficult spiritual path. I was happy because Kanai and the other Bauls recognized me as one of them and made me their friend and companion. I forgot the pain of being rejected by my family and immersed myself in the family of the Bauls and the kingship of their songs. Kanai and I travelled together from that time. There was only one time that I left him for an extended period. That was when I became obsessed with trying to live without food, like the saints and yogis in the old stories. These saints controlled all their desires and so never ate. They lived on air alone. I wanted to find out if that was still possible. So I went off on my own and I found a bell, a wood apple tree, in a forest near a pond. We believe these trees are very auspicious. I sat there in my loincloth and meditated for 2 years, eating less and less until I stopped eating altogether, taking a vow that no food would pass my lips until I reached my goal and achieved enlightenment. I don't know how I lived. I had matted dreadlocks down to my knees and sat there, not eating, not smoking, drinking nothing but water. I focused inwards, conserving my energies, and I sat there like that through 2 monsoons and 2 cold winters. I used to visit him, said Kanai, who's blind, incidentally. The villagers knew where he was and would lead me to him through the forest. They called him Beltala Babaji, the sadhu who sits under the wood apple tree. He was very weak and very thin. He hardly moved or talked, only very short sentences. I was anxious that he wouldn't survive, and it pained me that he wouldn't eat. I brought him food, but he refused to eat it. He was very determined. I don't know what I achieved with this penance, said Debu, but I know that my mind was at peace as never before. My hair was matted, but the knots of my heart were untied. After a certain point, I stopped feeling hunger. I was at the end of desire, beyond the senses. It was then that I started hallucinating. I was no longer living inside my body. I was somewhere outside of myself, in a state of ecstasy and rapture. I've never felt anything like it before or since. Then one cold, starry night around the time of Makar Sankranti, I felt suddenly lost, as if my mind had finally detached itself from my body like a bird flying high. It was Kanai who brought me back. What do you mean? I said. I was unaware of it, but there had been a terrible storm. Kanai had a premonition that I was in trouble and came over from Tarapit to see if I was all right. He arrived early in the morning with a group of villagers and found me up to my neck in a pool of mud, fast asleep. They all thought I was dead, and I suppose I almost was. Kanai brought me back to his house in Tarapit and nursed me back to health. The blind man saved the man who could see, said Kanai, chuckling to himself. Sometimes the mad and the sightless can see and understand things better and more clearly than the sane and the sighted. The blind are never deceived by appearances, said Debu. Maybe, said Kanai, it is only those of us who have no eyes that can see through the lure of Maya and glimpse reality for what it is. Thank you. I'd like to open with Tharik, as it's his first time at the festival. When we were talking earlier, you were discussing, I think many of us around the table probably have a very benign attitude on travel writing. This is a reaching out, trying to understand. But there are many critiques of travel writing that see it as a colonial enterprise, as one that has othered people elsewhere in the world and presented the world with caricatures and Orientalist stereotypes. I wondered what your take on the genre was, Tharik. Where do you... No pressure at all.
Nice, easy question to start with on my debut at Jaipur. Thank you. That's really what I'm trying to wrangle with in my book. The fact that I have to introduce people to the concept of an indigenous Muslim Europe is the reason why this debate is so necessary. You see, Islam has been in Europe since the 7th century, and there is an indigenous Muslim Europe more than at least 6 centuries old that is alive and well, and that's before we start talking about Moorish Spain and so on. But the fact that I had to go and quote-unquote discover it, a lot of that for me, in my research, I put down to, in part, the impact of travel writing. Because historically, I think travel writing and, the kind of the historic travel writing of especially this part of Europe, it was often seen as this kind of nice, inoffensive genre that people just enjoy, and it doesn't really have any impact on anything in reality. But of course, the truth is, for centuries, it's helped to construct our worldview of places that most of us in the past could not go out to, could not experience. And what I found with most travel literature on what is defined as Eastern Europe, especially the English language travel literature, is that often it was written, of course, by a particular demographic, and that particular demographic viewed that part of the world and the Muslim culture in that part of the world as something that is foreign, that is alien, and therefore that is other. And this becomes very apparent in the writing. And what then happens is we as travel writers, all of us, myself, we're all vulnerable and susceptible to this, is we inherit this consciously or unconsciously as we read this literature in order to either quote it, which I've done as well, cite it, or just to become familiar with this space. And this unconscious othering and this unconscious bias that can come through, sometimes it can be quite blatant, in that people clearly had a particular position and a perspective of the culture and the people. And at other times, even the most sympathetic, somebody like Edith Durham, who's seen as this great queen of Albania, when you analyse her work in the cold light of day to day, you also see the subtleties of the prejudice of the time. Because Edith, to take a very interesting example, she was writing at a time when, for example, eugenics was all the rage. And the empire was at its peak. And so, as lovely as she was and as well-intended as she was of a class that did see themselves by default as superior to the people she was writing about. And this comes through even though she is very, very sympathetic. So what I'm getting at is we need to kind of assess this work as and when we take it on. We need to revisit it and not just accept the consensus. I followed in the footsteps of an Ottoman traveller called Evliya Çelebi. I had to go back to the 17th century in order to find somebody.
Who wrote Reams and Reams.
Reams and Reams.
Enormous.
Exactly. But it had to be
description of the Ottoman
translated
Empire.
by somebody else.
Yeah.
And that was the only...
It's a mystery why it's not in English. It's
Exactly.
one of the great accounts of the Middle East.
Exactly. Probably because it's got 20 volumes or something. But the point I was going to make is Evliya Çelebi was one of the only English language texts that I could find of this area where the culture was being celebrated as its own. It was his culture. It was something to be admired, appreciated, and that put a completely different perspective on things. Like, I turned up in Sarajevo and I was supposed to be in this exotic Jerusalem of Europe. I was reading Evliya Çelebi's work. It wasn't exotic at all. Everywhere he travelled was a Jerusalem of Europe.
Brilliant. Pallavi, do you feel that this is a genre you have to sort of do battle with, or is it something you find quite naturally, just a first-person narrative, and you don't feel you're carrying a backpack of history and ethnography with you?
No, I absolutely love travel writing because it's such a sort of umbrella genre and it can fit in so many different kinds of writing. So my day job has really been that of a foreign correspondent, and I've spent the last 25 years living in different parts of the world.
Notably China and Japan.
China, Japan, Indonesia, Belgium, Tokyo, and now Madrid. I've tended to spend a substantial period of time in all of these places, learn the languages, do a lot of in-depth reading, particularly delve into the relationships between India and these countries. I do think that a lot of travel writing in the past has been quite racialized, and I do think that we haven't had people from non-sort of Western parts of the world wandering around the world and talking about them. They haven't had the authority, they haven't had the resources to be able to do this in the past. And I think that we actually get very different perspectives on countries when we diversify the perspective of the writer. And this became very clear to me quickly in my career as a foreign correspondent when I was based in Beijing, for example, between 2002 and 2008. And I'll give you a very everyday example, something like the traffic in Beijing. I'd be sitting there with, say, a German colleague of mine, and the German would look at the traffic and would be like, oh my God, this is so chaotic. Nobody follows the rules. These people are crazy. And then an Indian would look at the traffic and would be like, oh my God, this is so orderly. Everybody's following the rules. They're driving like robots. So it was quite hilarious because you would see exactly the same phenomenon, the traffic, but come away with, they're crazy, they don't know how to drive, or wow, they drive so well. But most of the world was reading about the crazy, they don't know how to drive, rather than wow, they drive so well, which is what I would, I think, bring to it. So yeah. Go on.
Colin, you wrote a wonderful essay, I remember, in the TLS more than a decade ago, just when, in a sense, there was that sort of beginning of this post-colonial, postmodern critique of travel writing, and there were beginning to get works coming out, mainly in an academic context, saying that travel writing was this problematic genre, and that it was about dominance and Western men going out and giving their view of the world. And you wrote a rather moving defence at that time. Is that still something you would subscribe to, or would you give it, or? I mean, would you no give your? I mean, defend it in a sense, if you would.
Well, it was less a defence than a kind of a nuancing of it, if you like, because I of course I'm the dinosaur of this group. I started travel writing in the early '60s. And
there's a wonderful photograph in the first edition of Colin's first book that I have, of Colin with the same head of hair, remarkably unchanged, but a different colour in those days, and with this very thin boy with bicycle clips.
Yeah. He's made up nearly all of that.
It's travel writing.
Well, in those days, there were really a handful of travel writers that were known at all, and almost all of them, with the exception, I think, of, say, Devlin Murphy, were male, white, and single. They had a certain kind of education, a privileged education, albeit of a in its way, quite a narrow kind. And that's where I came from. But it struck me always that, I mean, as Pallavi said, that travel writing is one culture looking at another. You think you're writing from a position of natural authority, you might, but within a few years, your culture is as up for judgment and as in a way vulnerable as the cultures that you're looking at. So I think travel writing has always been like that. You give away yourself. It's one of the strengths of the genre, is that the writer himself is in a way up for criticism, in a way that, say, an academic article is not, or a history is not. The travel writer's there in the first person singular in the narrative. I did this, I did that. And so there comes a sort of dialogue between the self of the writer and the culture that he's describing. And in no time, it becomes, in a way, quite fascinatingly up for grabs, if you like, for the reader.
If I remember rightly, you used the phrase that it was a mistake to see travel writing as an attempt to express dominance so much as an attempt at understanding.
Well, yes. I think a lot of the critique, which came, I think, originally from Marie-Louise Pratt, I think, and Edward Said, of course, it came through academe, that travel writing was a neo-colonial genre. And there was a lot of truth in that, and travel writers have to look at themselves and be wary of it. At the same time, it was very much influenced, I think, by Foucault and by the idea that you see the world through dominance. The travel writer has power, if you like, because he has knowledge, and knowledge gives power. He has knowledge because he's in a society which he is able to go out. He has the money, the education to go out to some part of the world where most people don't have that knowledge, or they certainly don't have the knowledge of the travel writer who's wandering around amongst them. And so there's a sort of privilege, if you like, of that, the one who has the knowledge and power reporting on the other. And I think that can be overstated. I mean, people can travel for a massive different motives, certainly not usually through a desire to dominate, but through often a wish for understanding or even a respect of the other culture. And if we go on seeing relationships as those of power or less power, then they descend into paranoia. Even our relationships with friends or acquaintances, if we look at them, we realize that there's actually a certain subtle power balance in them. One is a little bit more dominant than the other, almost always. And that's something you have to acknowledge and be very aware of a travel writer, where it can be extreme, where somebody like me may be meeting, Chinese farmers or, somebody in a much less privileged position than me. One has to be aware of it, but not to be deflected. If one were to go the whole road down that idea that the privileged shouldn't travel, if you like, amongst the less privileged, then there's no dialogue left.
Manisha, I know this is something you feel very... This is something you've written about and feel strongly about yourself.
I have, yes. I mean, largely that came about from my own experience because, even when before this was published, I remember getting a response from a publisher saying, well, we just don't know where it would sit on the shelves. And I thought, well, it sits between Paul Theroux and Tim Parks in the railway section, which is exactly where it is. But it was that attitude of, well, we've saturated the railway market, that people do that, there's no space for you. And yet my writing is... I certainly don't travel on trains and see what Paul Theroux sees or what Tim Parks sees, because I'm not a white man. I've come from a different class, I've grown up with a different background, I have a very different perspective. My travel experience is completely different. And I had a real, like Tharik was saying, but you still do absorb what you're told by other travel writers and what you read. And I remember being really put off when I read one of Theroux's books that referred to young travel writers as opportunistic punks. And it was part of my research before I set off to do this, and I thought, my God, is there not a space for me? Am I not allowed to even enter this genre? And it was really stressful.
But you've been very successful. And your books are hugely well received and available everywhere and outsell many of the rest of us.
But that was when I look back at 2010, trying to get this published. I mean, we got this published in India first before it was published in the UK. I had to write it and get it out there before anyone took it on here. And then obviously there were people who bought it, so I did better after that. But
do you think the world has changed?
Yes, completely. So in that 12-year period, I'm now surrounded by people who aren't just posh white men travel writing, and it really wasn't that way 12 years ago. I mean, I could not name a single brown woman doing travel writing, or any black people, and even that specific element of travel writing is still very small.
Anthony, as the other posh white male on the would you like?
I have nothing against the posh white men at all, but there is space, and I think this is the thing that people are getting wrong at the moment. That they feel like posh white men are being pushed out. They're the minority. They're they're dying breed. No one's saying go away.
I'd like to ask Anthony whether he's a dying breed.
Simply, there is space for everybody. There is space for everyone to be writing these narratives. It's not just one niche corner that can sort of take this on.
I agree. I mean, I think we are entering what may be the great period of travel writing precisely because of this, because things have opened up, and it's not just males of a certain age and a certain class that get to go travelling, who can afford to go travelling, and so this huge opening up of travel writing. I would just say I've only written one
optimistic note to end on. This
I've only written one travel book, and I didn't want to put myself in it. It was about Egypt, and it was about what has survived in Egypt of the ancient culture, of the pharaonic
It's
culture.
a wonderful book. You should tell everybody to go downstairs and buy it.
It's called the Pharaoh Shadow. It's probably not in the bookshop. But I wanted to go travelling with an Egyptian because I wanted to see what his or her response would be to these things. But they simply didn't find it of interest. And the review in the Egyptian press, well, there were two that appeared on opposites, literally 2 pages. Of the same newspaper, Al Ahram newspaper. One sort of was a rave review, and the other was entitled "Of No Interest," and it really was. And I think, but so that's something. And I kept
award for candidness on stage goes to.
But the thing is, I think it was of interest, and it was important to do that because a lot of those traditions and superstitions that survive in Egypt today are in danger of disappearing. But no Egyptian had thought of doing it, and so in defence of all travel writers and even posh white male, I would say there is a purpose to it as well.
I think one of the things that, just to give the last one before we open it up to questions, I think one of the things that I love about travel writing is that, at least traditionally, it has been this genre which, unlike the novel, has come independently in every part of the world. And you mentioned Evliya Çelebi. Evliya Çelebi is a fantastic example. Someone wrote, as you said, 20 volumes of travel writing on the entire Ottoman world in spectacular detail, and it's one of the great masterpieces. But it isn't alone. You go Xuanzang coming out of China and going down to India. In every culture, Japan, Ibn Battuta coming from Tangiers, every culture has produced this genre, and so despite the frequent death knells that are rung for it occasionally in literary magazines, it does seem to me something which is basic to our being, what it is to be human, to go on a journey and to learn from it and want to communicate that.
I think it's important to say this is about travel writing in the English language. For example, I could have accessed tons of pieces of travel literature in Turkish on the Balkans, which would have given me a completely different perspective. So I think the issue that we are discussing here is not to push anybody out. It's the fact that we've only ever had that narrow prism in the English language travel writing, and it's that literary heritage we're battling.
Can we insist on one question? One question. Super, thank you. This lady with her hand straight up here at the back. Hand up, yep.
Thank you. This is for you because what you just read out sounds exactly like Buddha's story. And did you mean it to be Buddha's story? Of course, there was a difference because Buddha was Kshatriya and the person you're describing was a Brahmin. That's one. And second, with all my compliments, the way it's written, it's not like a travel story at all. It's almost as if you're inside the culture. And when you're writing with such empathy and such depth of what it means for a blind person and how it's so easy to imagine a bunch of villagers just coming and pulling someone out of the mud and all of that. Would you be writing the same way if it was not India and any other culture?
Well, it was precisely this sort of criticism of travel writing that led me particularly, and I think that's particularly of Westerners reporting Indian religion. It's instantly, it's almost impossible to avoid the charge of exoticism if you do it in your own voice. So I set out very deliberately with this book to do it as a series of interviews and to have, as with the passage read out, have their voices giving their own stories. And for me to be although it's not possible, and of course I have set up framing and everything, but to be as transparent a vessel for their stories as I could be. And yes, I mean, I suspect Debu probably had the Buddha in mind, but I think, it is the basic ascetic way. Tapasya involves not eating and starving and meditating, and that's how it's been done for centuries. But it's very interesting, though, to find someone in the real life who had actually tried this and what happened to them. But thank you all very much. And thank you, this amazing panel.
Thank you.
Whatever you did, if it wasn't good enough, you needed to try and do better and keep at it.
Actually, village life produces the philosophical ideas that are germane to democratic thought and practice.
I mean, just losing 4 of your bandmates, soulmates is bad enough. But the worst thing is, out of those 4 families, 2 of the families blamed me.
But the progress from 1991 to 2017, I think, only took India to a better place.
It was really through the transition into politics that I had the good luck of becoming a writer.